My lecture last night was about how America had entered what I call a negative world. And since I know some people were arriving this morning and didn't come there, I'll just very briefly summarize my three worlds model, although I won't go through everything I said last night. But the key is, although we never had a state church like in Europe, for most of American history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our de facto national religion. And that began to unravel in the 1960s. Christianity began to go into decline in America. And I divide that period of decline between 1964 and today into three phases or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. The positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. It's a period of decline for Christianity. All is not well in that time, to be sure, and yet Christianity is still basically viewed positively by society. People think you're an upstanding member of society if you're a regular churchgoer, and Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society. 1994, we had a tipping point, enter what I call the neutral world, where Christianity isn't seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian doesn't help you get a job on places like Wall Street. Quite the opposite, in fact. Christian moral norms are now expressly repudiated and indeed often now viewed as the leading threat to the new public moral order. Again, a lot of the writing that you see about Christian nationalism is now in this vein. And so, if you missed the lecture last night, it's all in my book, A Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. But what I want to talk about this morning is, how do we live in this negative world? How do we live in this world that's maybe very different from the ones that most of us, grew up in or knew not that long ago? I mean, things have changed a lot just in the past decade. And last night I highlighted a couple of items. I said we should adopt a posture of exploration, that we should remain prudentially engaged in politics, culture, etc. And one point that I made that I didn't go into detail on is I said that we needed to rebalance away from relevance and transformation towards being a counterculture. And so what I want to do today is sort of unpack that and its implications a little bit. I actually took this from Tim Keller and his book, Center Church. So Center Church is Keller's church planting manual. It's probably my favorite book of all of his that I wrote. And he takes H. Richard Niebuhr's famous Christ and culture model from the 1950s, which looks at 5 different ways that the church has related to the culture. I think it's very different. My model is about how the culture views the church. Niebuhr's model is about how the church views the culture, basically. But Keller came up with essentially 4 styles or ways of relating to the culture in terms of churches that he labeled relevance, transformation, counterculture, and 2 kingdoms. I'm not going to talk much about 2 kingdoms today, but I'll mention the other ones briefly. In relevance, this emphasizes things like the idea that God is already at work out in the world, and we're to join in with what God is already doing. It's about bringing the church to the culture, to the problems of the day, to life as it's lived in the world. And so Keller put mainline Protestantism in the category of relevance. And he also said that the seeker-sensitive movement, which one of the 3 evangelical movements I mentioned last night, was also a strategy primarily of relevance. And I would agree with that. I think it's a way to try to make church relevant to people's lives, to get them in the door in an era when Christianity is in decline in America. He didn't directly talk about what I call cultural engagement, which is essentially the urban church model, but I would argue cultural engagement is also primarily a strategy of relevance, although sometimes it has transformationalist aspirations. Transformationalism sees the kingdom of God expanding out into the world, kind of transforming the world as it grows. And Keller put the culture war in the transformationalism bucket because, I think it's very clear. The goal of the culture war was to transform politics and culture, through political activity. We want to capture government and use it to bring society's laws and other things into conformance with God's laws. So I think that is basically the strategy of transformation. Counterculture, as a strategy, tends to emphasize our citizenship in heaven above our citizenship in earth. It tends to talk about separating from the world, as in 1 John. It tends to look at the church as a new kind of community that's been inaugurated by God and Jesus in the New Testament. And an example of counterculture would be something like the Anabaptists. An Anabaptist sect like the Amish would be a kind of a pure play counterculture. They're living apart from the world, building this kind of a community. But there are also evangelicals that you could put into the counterculture category. I think so the Neo-Anabaptist movement and sort of the new monastics, if you're familiar with them. Many of them would fall into the counterculture bucket. And so my argument is that we should think about rebalancing the emphasis of church away from relevance and transformation towards being a counterculture. Not that we should go live off the grid like the Amish or do anything of that nature, but evangelicalism has primarily existed in the relevance and transformation worlds. And in a negative world, thinking about the church as a counterculture is going to become much more important. So again, for much of our history, Protestant Christianity was the majority default culture of the United States. Our institutions were designed around Protestant norms and values. Again, if you think to the 1950s, when you have prayer in school and you have Bible reading in school, most likely the values that kids are being taught in the schools basically align and reinforce the values they're learning in church to a great extent. Might not all have been theological, but many of the institutions of society sort of reinforced the Protestant values of this generic Protestant consensus. So evangelicals, didn't really have to think too much about, highly differentiating and sustaining their own community life in that environment, because society, to a great extent, it was at least somewhat friendly to it. Well, that's certainly no longer the case. You're certainly not going to have values that you're going to learn in the public schools that are going to reinforce what the kids are learning on Sunday morning. The evangelical church is no longer a moral majority, but a moral minority. And when you are a minority, then you have to be much more intentional about self-consciously stewarding the strength and health of your own community. So that's something that, non-Protestant religious minorities in the United States have always had to do. And the example I like to give as maybe a good parallel for us is early 20th century Catholicism. So it was Christianity, and yet this was a Protestant country, and pre-war America was in many ways kind of anti-Catholic. And you had a lot of these, mostly European immigrants, who were here who said, if we want to live as faithful Catholics in this Protestant country, we have to have institutions and practices that demarcate, sustain, and transmit community life and our values intergenerationally. So they built the Catholic Parish School Network. They built Catholic universities. They built Catholic fraternal societies. They created a whole infrastructure of Catholicism in America that had to a much greater extent than Protestantism, serve as a substitute for the mainstream institutions of society. And even when Catholics were sort of admitted into mainstream society in the second half of the 20th century, they never let go of those institutions. And I think that's one reason the Catholic Church has been stronger than we have in certain areas like intellectual life, is because they had that institutional legacy that we didn't have. So now we have to think we're the minority now in the country. It's difficult to adjust. That's a very difficult mindset shift for people who are used to thinking of themselves as the majority to adopt. And now we need to start adopting the practices of minority groups. And again, that doesn't mean being hateful towards society or other people. It just means if we want to sustain and pass on our beliefs, our community, we have to be very intentional about doing that. Another example we might look at, if you're interested in thinking about what are some good examples for us to do parallel, might be the Mormons and what they had to do for many years, being viewed sort of skeptically as a heretical Christian sect. So I want to talk a little bit about what it might mean to create that counterculture. What would it mean to be a church that lived in a way that is meaningfully distinct from the surrounding world and the surrounding society? And I'm not going to attempt to preach a sermon that goes through the Bible and tries to draw out this sort of theological explication of what that would look like. I'll leave that to other people. As I always say, I am not a theologian or a Bible teacher. I always stress that. I'm a cultural critic. Again, I come from a consulting background. I'm a lot talking about the context of how pastors and theologians have to apply their work today. But I know a lot about organizations from that background and organizational culture and thinking about that. So while this isn't biblical, I do think there are some parallels between us and the New Testament church, not in the sense that we're undergoing persecution like they did, but they were under no illusions that they were going to reform or change the institutions of the Roman Imperium. There weren't going to be any elections that their candidates were going to be running in and winning. And they had to create and sustain this kind of new and different form of community. So there's probably some things we can learn there. And so, again, what I'm going to tell you a couple things today, it's not a script. This is not a script to follow. I think these are ideas for you to kind of wrestle with and consider to get your mind thinking. And maybe they're also intended to be a little bit provocative, to maybe challenge some of the ways that we've been thinking and operating. So I want to hit two big themes I think that we could think about what would it mean practically to be a counterculture. And the first one is about rejecting vice. Churches used to have a long list of things you weren't supposed to do. You weren't supposed to, no drinking, right? No dancing. And I think we've moved away from that a lot. And there are definitely still churches and institutions that have a no alcohol policy. But, I think today a lot of that is viewed as fundamentalist. It's viewed as legalistic. It's kind of viewed as old-fashioned. And, we've kind of moved away from it. And I think today you're a lot more likely to hear gospel-centered, what they call gospel-centered preaching, which really emphasizes the indicative over the imperative. It's much more focused on what Christ has already accomplished for us and much less focused on how we are supposed to live in response to that. And I think there's been a little bit of a retreat that I've seen over the course of my life, that we only sort of preach against things if we have a very, very clear proof text that shows that it is objectively sinful that we're doing it. So we know there's a commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. So we tend to be pretty strong on sexual ethics because there's very strong ground to stand on. But, I think there are other things out there that I'm not hearing a lot about, even though there are very destructive things that are sort of tearing up our society. And one of the things that I noted yesterday is that when we think about this negative world, we tend to think about how it affects us. Here's how it affects the church. Here's how it affects how people see us. Here's how it affects how we have to live. But it actually has a pervasive impact on our society. It's affecting many things that don't obviously have anything to do with the church. And, I used the example yesterday of Donald Trump. In a positive or a neutral world, Donald Trump would never have been elected president. He could only get elected president in a negative world, where the old standards have now essentially been rejected. And another implication that we see is that our society has seen the metastasization of vice. You know, there are so many things that used to be the province of shady characters like the mafia that are now fully legitimized multi-billion-dollar businesses. For example, drugs. You used to have to go to some, dimly lit street corner in a dodgy neighborhood to buy drugs. Now you just go down to the fully legal pot dispensary down the street. Pot is de facto legalized in most of America. Psychedelics are now essentially being normalized and mainstreamed and becoming legal in some places. And who knows where else we're going to go. You can also think about gambling. You used to have to go to the bookmaker to do that. My family's actually Sicilian on my mother's side, and I'm sad to report some of my relatives in the 20th century were in fact involved in that business. You don't need to do that anymore. You just pull out your phone, start betting on the big game right here. You don't have to do anything else. Poor Pete Rose, remember him? Banned for life from baseball for gambling. Now the leagues themselves are partners in the gambling business. What really gets me is that sort of these ultimate clean-cut, all-American boy types like Peyton and Eli Manning are now gambling pitchmen. So they obviously have no concern whatsoever that being representatives of the gambling industry is going to hurt their brand. People accept it. It is the norm in our society. You can also think about loan sharking. Again, if you were desperate for a high-interest loan, you could go to the mob. They'd break your leg if you didn't pay them back. Now you can just go to the payday loan store. We got one on every block in poor neighborhoods, and you can pay 3,000% APR or something like that. We used to have usury laws. We used to have things that protected the vulnerable. Everything is now gone today. And it's so easy to ruin your life with much of this stuff. I don't know if you saw the news, but the son of YouTube's former CEO just died of a drug overdose at Berkeley. And you can believe, if it can affect people like that, it can affect our kids and grandkids. And it can affect us if we're not careful. Just read an article in the Wall Street Journal. A woman lost $400,000 on DraftKings. Unbelievable. It was a crazy story what they did to keep her going. And so I think we ought to have at least some degree of focus in our community that's saying, although this is how the world may live, this is not how we live, and that we reject the characteristic vices of our age. And again, somebody asked, well, Aaron, can you point me to a verse in the Bible that says it's a sin to gamble? I can't. I mean, I don't know what one is. Can I point to the Bible verse that says it's a sin to smoke pot? I can't do that. I mean, and maybe that's why I've never heard, although Christians used to be staunchly anti-gambling, I don't hear much about it today. But I keep coming back to Paul, who said, all things may be lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. And I would say that these vices are unprofitable. They're practically the definition of the folly that we are called on to avoid. And so I would suggest that one of the things we should establish in our community is that we reject the characteristic vices of our age. And I even put together a short list. And my work is mostly focused on men's issues in the church. So most of these are probably things that maybe more men are more likely to be prone to, but maybe not entirely. And I just say, no porn, no pot, no gambling, and no profanity. How about those? Porn, I think, is enough said. I think the churches remain very strong. Porn is sinful, but the world is saturated with it. Almost 2/3 of men under the age of 40 are regular consumers of pornography. Might even be higher than that. And women today are also doing that. We have to say no to that. Again, pot. I know people who are super high productivity, high energy people who smoke a lot of pot. Some people can do it and get away with it. A lot of other people, there's a reason our stereotype of the pot smoker is a slacker. And it's a serious, there's a lot of serious risk with this. Today's pot is not the pot that Bill Clinton didn't inhale in college. It's massively more potent. It does actually cause psychosis in some people, particularly young people. You can die of a fentanyl overdose from drugs that it's contaminated with that you don't even know are there. The Wall Street Journal just did an article where they were talking about how people are coming down with these bizarre fungal infections that they picked up from contamination on their pot that they got at a legal dispensary. There's all kinds of contaminants. And any of us have been in urban neighborhoods today, including many very nice urban neighborhoods. Pot smoke is everywhere. And is this a place that people with families want their kids to be playing or going down the street? I don't think so. And so I think, tobacco is already roundly stigmatized in our society today, but strangely enough, pot is actually actively celebrated and promoted. I think it's something that we should avoid. And then again, gambling, it's super dangerous. Lots of people can gamble, no problem, but it's no secret that a huge percentage of gambling companies' profits come from a relative handful of people who are addicted and have problems with gambling. And the only way to find out if you're one of those people is to take the chance. It's kind of like playing a little bit of Russian roulette. And, this is asymmetric warfare. These companies are multi-billion-dollar companies who are digitally deploying cutting-edge psychological manipulation techniques in order to keep you gambling. It's exactly the sort of techniques that are used by the social media companies to keep us all scrolling on our phones. And look how effective that is. I can't give up my Twitter. And so the truth is, you're probably not going to be, not only are you not going to beat these guys because the house always wins, but they are coming after you with weapons that you can't even recognize. And again, profanity. I've noticed, to be honest, a lot of increase in profanity in Christian circles, in the last decades. And I sometimes see a lot of debates online about it. And, people will make the point that the Bible, well, there's explicit language in the Bible here and there and all of that. And again, I don't want to necessarily get in debate because I just think it's an unprofitable thing. I mean, for the most part, you're probably not going to get in any trouble if you avoid profanity. And so those are some of the things that I think about in terms of how do we live differently from the world? How do we have a community that's different, that operates by a different standard? And again, I think rejecting vice is one idea to do that. And again, maybe you don't care for that idea. Maybe you don't like my list, and I think that's fine. Again, I'm not presenting that as the authoritative, biblical list, but I want us to think this world lives by a very different set of values than the church. How is our community going to live differently than the world? What practices are we going to do that's differently? The second thing I want to highlight is I think we also need to focus on sort of repairing our family economy. I talk a lot about this in the book, and in fact, there's a whole chapter on gender in my book. And one reason is that, again, the very unhealthy trends have sort of taken over the world, and too much of them are present in the church. We know, again, that there's too much pornography in the church. We know it's a problem. We know that divorce rates are too high in the church. And yes, if you look at regular church attenders, divorce rates are lower than they are in society. And that's great, but I think we still have too much. But the one thing I really want to hone in on is this, what I call the rise of post-familialism. And what do I mean by that? Throughout human history, the family has been the normative institution within which people built their lives. And today, that is increasingly no longer the case, in which very large shares of our society, by choice, some of them by choice, others by circumstance, have rejected the family as the place to build a life and are essentially not getting married and not having any children. A quarter of 40-year-olds in America have never been married. That's up a lot. I'm Generation X. That's the millennials. My generation, Generation X, I think it was 12%. Now it's up to that. Demographer Lyman Stone estimates that among younger Americans, a third of them will never get married. And again, the number of single people actually exceeds this because a lot of people got married and got divorced already, or perhaps were widowed. A quarter of millennial women will never have children. It's one of the stats that I just saw. And again, I don't have the stat for men in the United States, but in other countries, the share of men who end up childless is significantly higher than the share of women who end up childless. Again, Lyman Stone has found that women's desired fertility significantly exceeds their realized fertility, which basically means that the number of children women are actually have in life is less than the number of children those women themselves say that they want. And so it's about actually a child or more gap. People who want children are not having children or not having as many children as they want. And this is not just a US phenomenon, it's happening in Europe. It's especially advanced in East Asia, places like Korea, Taiwan, China, Japan. And birth rates are actually falling around the world. Sociologist Brad Wilcox, there's a couple books I'll recommend. One is a new book by sociologist Brad Wilcox called Get Married, making the case for people to get married. Another one is by an economist named Melissa Carney called The Two-Parent Privilege, which talks about the advantage of two-parent families. But I want to quote a line from Brad Wilcox's book. He says, quote, "The bad news about family life in America is that a large and growing minority of men and women will not marry or have children, leaving them without any immediate kin as they head into midlife and later life. This is sobering because many of them will end up aging and dying essentially alone, largely unvisited and uncared for in their final years by anyone but a nursing home attendant, home health care aide, or care robot," unquote. There are going to be profound implications to our society, to people foregoing family. And how has the church been responding to this as we've seen it in the pews? And one thing that I have seen is that the church is essentially trying to normalize long-term singleness in important ways. Google no longer tells you how many hits like a certain thing, because I've had some changes. But I went to Bing, and if anything, Google probably has more than this. I searched on Bing for the idolatry of the family, and it came back with 3.4 million hits. I searched for a gift of singleness, and it came back with 628,000 hits. And so I think we need to be clear that there are serious problems and challenges with people meeting and getting married and staying married today. There are many people who want to get married and are doing everything they can to try to get that they know how, and yet, through no fault of their own, are still single. And so I think realistically, we are going to have growing numbers of people who are single in our pews, and we have to be a welcoming place for those people. And I think it's going to be a major pastoral theme in coming years. But at the same time, I don't think we can essentially sell out the future of our young people by sort of normalizing and saying this is all just fine and maybe even better, as we hear in some cases. And I think pastors don't necessarily have the best insights into the reality of what it means to be single long-term or to try to be dating in your 30s, 40s, 50s, or beyond. Lots of pastors got married young, and they had a lot of kids. And so they just don't have any experience with that. I got married at age 46 and had my son at age 47. My son is also autistic. Why is he autistic? Well, people can be autistic at any age, but the fact that we had our kid at age 47 probably has something to do with that. I would always tell people, don't do what I did, right? And I'm one of the lucky people who actually did manage to get married and have a kid. And I can tell you, as someone who dated in those age ranges and was single in those age ranges, it is not as pleasant an experience as many people would be presenting. So I think we have to find a way to try to promote and encourage marriage as normative within our communities. And if Mormons can do it, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, if Orthodox Jews can do it, and they're doing a really great job of it, then I think we have opportunities to do pretty well too. And I think so much of our teachings about gender and marriage in the church focus on things like the complementarian versus egalitarian debate. And the thing is, like, it doesn't really speak to a lot of the realities of people's lives and challenges today. For one thing, it doesn't matter who the head of the household is if you're not married and you don't have any prospect of getting married. And I actually got interested in writing about religious issues. I was actually a public policy analyst at a think tank in New York. And that was great. And I saw that young men were turning to online influencers and turning away from the church. And I started seeing this a decade ago. And then now, of course, everybody knows who Jordan Peterson is. People have heard of Joe Rogan. Was just at a Jordan Peterson event in Indianapolis. He sold out a 2,500-seat theater at very steep prices. Lots of people love what he has to say. And so I started studying, why are people turning to these influencers? And one reason I've determined is that they are actually giving people information and speaking about many of the direct challenges young people are having in ways that the church is not. So, for example, the number one way by far that people meet today is on online dating. And if you listen to these online influencers, they will tell you all about how online dating works. And the thing about online dating compared to, the old style is that because it's on a computer, you can actually do data analysis to get hard objective data about how people are behaving on the system. And there's tons of research out there on it, and it's actually pretty bleak. I mean, once you read the research, you probably won't want to be on online dating, but you're going to find out all about this from online influencers, but you're not going to hear it in the church. We're not going to know about the dynamics of the way people are doing it. And so maybe I'll just give a couple examples. I'll get a little wonky here, just to give you just a highlight of some of the things that are there. There's been some research done. A lot of it was done on a lot of the early research was done on a site called OkCupid. It's now owned by Match.com, I think. But they looked at the age of the people that members of the opposite sex find most attractive. And so they looked at, for women, how old are the men that they find most attractive? And what they found was that the age that of the man that women find most attractive is someone about their own age. Younger women tend to think slightly older men are more attractive. Older women tend to think slightly younger men are attractive. But by and large, the age of the man that a woman finds most attractive is right around her own age. It's like a line, almost like plot a 45-degree line on the chart. Well, you might not be surprised when they looked at how men looked at that regardless of how old men are, they think the best-looking women are all in their early 20s. And so, but then there's some other things, so you probably could have guessed that one. But here's one you may not have known, is they also looked at the distribution of ratings. And so they looked at like how all the men rated women on these sites. And if you plotted it on a graph, it looks basically like a bell curve, exactly what you would expect. They think most women are about average in attractiveness, and then there's like a few that kind of taper out to the extremes. But when they looked at how women rated men, what they found is women rate 81% of men below average in attractiveness and only 7% above average. And so, unsurprisingly, men face very high inequality in dating. It's a tough market for both men and women because of these things. And there's so much data that's been done there. And the fact is, I don't even think most of us in the church really know any of this stuff. And so if people in the church are very much also in the online dating world, And so it's like, how are we equipping people to understand the world and successfully navigate it, or find alternatives to online dating to bring people together? I think that's very important. It's very important for us to be, actively helping young people to understand and navigate this world. A second thing I might add, and this is one where candidly I think a lot of some of the things people are saying are just not correct, which has to do with attraction. And because I would, when I was single, I would listen to sermons, I'd read these books, and they say, well, what do women want? What do Christian women want in a man? And they'd say they're interested in a servant leader. They're interested in a man who's on fire for God. He's kind, he's conscientious, he's emotionally supportive and affirming. He likes to help with kids. All of those things we've all heard before. And I think that conflates two different things. Because when we're trying to find someone that we want to marry, there's really two things that we care about. We care about whether they look attractive, and we care about whether they would be a good candidate to marry. I think we all know that there are people that might be very attractive and yet would be bad people to marry. The lead singer in the rock and roll band, for example, might fall into that category. I think we also know that there are people who might be great husband or wife material, but for whatever reason, they're just not as attractive. Maybe they're a little socially awkward, And so, I think about my son being autistic. Maybe he'll be in that category of someone who's a little socially awkward. Can I coach him past that? And sometimes it's not even people's fault. And so, servant leadership might help determine whether someone is a good care person that you would want to marry. Obviously, you want to marry someone who's on fire for God, but it doesn't tell people what's actually attractive. What's attractive, I think, is what we know, that it's things like power and status, confidence and charisma, looks and style, things like money. And so, again, when you read, I'll just contrast, what you see in church with what you hear from Jordan Peterson. One pastor, a very famous pastor, has this line, "Godliness is sexy to godly people." Jordan Peterson, in his book, 12 Rules for Life, said, "Girls are attracted to boys who win status competitions with other boys." Which one of those is more accurate? Which boy did Taylor Swift decide that she wanted to date? The guy who just won the Super Bowl, all right? The guy who's going to be in the Hall of Fame, the star athlete. And so I think, these are things that we're missing out, I think, on an enormous evangelistic opportunity. Young people today are searching for answers. That's why they're going to people like Jordan Peterson. And he's giving them factual, interesting, helpful information in a number of domains. Unfortunately, he's not telling them the gospel. He's not giving them the truth about Christianity. He's giving some kind of vague, I say, New Age type religion. And so I think this is a double problem for us. One, we're missing out on evangelistic opportunities. And secondly, we're not equipping our young people to really understand what it takes to prepare and equip themselves for marriage. Because, when I decided to go to college, I graduated from high school in 1988. I just kind of applied to schools, and I just got into one, and I picked it. Today, it's not like that. If you want to get into a good school, it's hyper-competitive. People are planning out, from before their kids are born, how they're going to get them into the right preschool program, the enrichment, how they're going to get them on the track. And, the thing is, getting married today is sort of like that. It's hard. The degree of difficulty dial on life has been turned up a lot. Getting married and staying married requires high degrees of intentionality, and even then, like getting into a good school, it's very hard. And so I think we really, as a church, need to be focused on helping our young people navigate this world and make family life continue to be the normative pattern in the church. And again, obviously, there are going to be many singles in the church. And the church has always had, a special concern for widows and things, going back to the very earliest days. We may not have as many widows in that sense, but we're probably going to have a lot of people who are just flat out single for no fault of their own. So we have to be a welcoming place there. But if we end up conformed to the world in all of these matters of family life, whether that be pornography consumption, whether it be divorce rates, whether it be people not getting married, we're not going to have a healthy community. And again, I think this is so huge. And if you read, Brad Wilcox's book, these things have an enormous impact on your well-being in life and human flourishing. And I think there is a sense in which there's a reason why the church does not talk about this stuff, and it's wise, and that's because most of it, the Bible doesn't say anything about dating. And if the pastor starts getting up and starts giving a bunch of dating advice, that's not really his area of expertise, most likely. Again, probably this guy got married very young, and so isn't even dating in this world. And you can really get burned that way. And that's what happened with the purity culture, I think. I read the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, before it was pulled by Joshua Harris. And it's got tons and tons and tons of advice in there that's presented as if it's the Christian way to do something. And it's really just this 21-year-old guy's ideas. Very little of it has any tie to the Bible. And so that harmed a lot of people. And so I think it really has to be lay leaders, all of us who are very involved in helping people, because we can't just rely on pastors to be like the all-purpose guides to life today. They don't do it. And again, I think there's many things that you could disagree with about what I just said. And I think, again, some of it's designed, I think, to challenge and provoke. But I think the key is, in this negative world, in a world where the culture is promoting many, many, many things that are contrary to the Word of God, and polyamory, you've probably heard and seen all of the articles that have been in the paper pushing open relationships. It's crazy what they're flogging these days, and things that will be very harmful to your life, even if they're not objectively sinful in some cases. We have to be a community that lives in a manner that is distinct from the world. And what does that look like? And so I don't think that the examples I just gave are the end-all, be-all of that. I think it's a much bigger thing. I didn't touch on Christian education, for example. I know a lot of people have talked about that, all the institutions we might need to create. But fundamentally, with all of the pressures of the negative world and all of the things that the world is pushing, we have to create a church that in at least some important ways is a counterculture that lives differently from the world. And again, I think that not only is good for us, but as I said with the Jordan Peterson example, it can actually be good for evangelism as well, as people say, hey, what is it that these people have that we don't have? There's actually been a lot written about that. Virtually all of the mommy influencers on the old mommy bloggers and mommy Instagrammers, almost all of them are Mormons, if you look at it. And they've just got, and sometimes even like secular feminists will say, why am I so obsessed with these Mormon mommies? So they just, like, this is like amazing. And so I think there's a lot about just having a healthy, functional life and community that is attractive to people, just as the Emperor Julian complained that people were turning to the church because of the way that they took care of their people. And I think there's lots of opportunities to see living as a countercultural community as a method and a way to also help us do mission as well. So again, I think we need to adopt that posture of exploration, because there's no 50-point plan to a counterculture. We're going to have to figure it out through trial and error and experimentation. But I really believe this is one of the things that we need to be thinking a lot about if we want to continue having healthy communities that follow God's word and transmit the faith on to the next generation. Thank you.
You're watching a special presentation of PCRT online. For the complete schedule as well as access to conference resources, visit alliancelive.org. That's alliancelive.org.